25 years in clinical practice and over 20,000 appointments later, it still amazes me how powerful feelings of guilt can be. In my experience, feelings of guilt are often widespread and can be particularly damaging for mood. And if you learn more about guilt through research, it seems that some people are particularly prone to feeling guilty, which can make it even more challenging to manage. Hi everyone, I'm Trevor Sullivan of Sullivan Associates Clinical Psychology. Today I'm going to talk about how to cope with feelings of guilt. This is part one of a two-part video. Before we get started, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. And if you're on YouTube, click the alert notification. That way, when we release more videos, you'll get notified. Guilt. Take a moment and say the word. There's a heaviness that seems to come with simply pronouncing it, and it's even more heavy to manage. But fortunately, there are things we can do to cope with this feeling, so it's far less impactful. Before we get into that, let's start with the definition of guilt. For our purposes, I think the good folks contributing to Wikipedia have done a pretty decent job of capturing the meaning. So based on their definition, guilt is a cognitive or emotional experience that occurs when a person believes or realizes, accurately or not, that they've compromised their own standards of conduct or have violated a universal moral standard and bear significant responsibility for that violation. That's a mouthful, but it sums it up nicely. For the sake of clarity though, let's break this definition down into four key parts. First, guilt can be mostly based on thought or it can be a more emotional experience. Second, guilt doesn't have to be based on something true. As long as we believe we should feel guilty, whether it's accurate or not, guilt can still occur. Third, to feel guilty, we have to violate a personal rule or a universal standard that most people accept. So it's possible to feel guilty based on violating our own rules, and it's also possible to avoid feeling guilty if we violate a universal standard that we don't accept. And fourth, guilt occurs when we bear significant responsibility for something we've done or perceive we've done. This can also help to explain why some people can admit to wrongdoing, but if they don't feel it's that big of a deal, they don't experience much guilt. But you might be wondering, why do we even experience guilt in the first place? In a 2007 study by Dr. David Amodio and colleagues, they set out to answer this very question. And as you can probably imagine, guilt isn't easy to measure in a scientific study. However, these researchers conducted a very clever experiment that falsely informed liberally minded participants that their responses to reviewing a series of faces on a screen appeared to be racist, based on the fake results of an electroencephalography, also known as an EEG. And in case you're wondering, an EEG is designed to measure electrical activity in the brain. In this case, the researchers were looking to identify abnormalities in brain waves in the frontal cortex, which indicate feelings of guilt. So in this study, lying to these poor liberally minded participants was successful, which was confirmed by the EEG as well as a self-report questionnaire. The researchers then proceeded to the next part of the experiment. Study participants were informed that the first study had ended early and were asked if they'd like to take part in a second, unrelated study. For research purposes, the studies were connected though. Participants were then shown 19 different magazine articles and asked which article they found most interesting. And 3 of these magazine articles focused on reducing racial prejudice. Not surprisingly, these poor guilt-ridden study participants, who were falsely informed that they responded in a racist manner earlier, were more likely to choose the article about reducing racial prejudice. So you might be wondering, what does this study tell us about guilt? There are 2 key findings. First, after inducing feelings of guilt, participants showed left frontal activity in their EEG. The activity in this part of the brain provides support for the theory that the study participants felt guilty, and initially, there's a desire to leave the situation. Second, after choosing a magazine article about reducing racial prejudice, EEG results showed a shift of activation onto the left side of the brain. This shift indicates that study participants were motivated by their guilt to try and make amends. So the important findings from this study show that the initial response to guilt is to withdraw from the situation, likely because we're designed to avoid feelings of pain and discomfort. But next, there's a desire to re-engage and make things right. This finding essentially combines 2 popular theories of guilt. First, the guilt about punishing the self, and second, guilt about undoing the damage we've done by making amends. So now that we have an idea of guilt's purpose, what's the next step? Ideally, is to minimize the amount of time you feel guilty. And some of you might be wondering, well, what's wrong with feeling guilty? Well, nothing initially. It's really just a signal, like all other emotions. However, as you probably noticed, feeling guilty isn't a particularly pleasant emotion. And just like any emotion that's uncomfortable, it generally isn't helpful to remain in that emotional state for particularly long. In a 2006 study by Dr. Kenneth Kendler and colleagues, they examined 20,692 Swedish twins to determine which personality trait was most detrimental for mood. Negative emotionality, which involves experiencing feelings of guilt and other negative emotions, such as fear, jealous, worry, envy, proved to be the strongest risk factors for experiencing depression. So needless to say, spending too much time drowning in negative emotions isn't helpful. And feeling a strong sense of guilt is clearly a negative emotion. Now that we've established why it's important to minimize the amount of time you feel guilty, let's take a look at my 5-step plan to help manage feelings of guilt. And for today, we're just going to focus on the first 2 steps, as I've got a little bit of homework for you to complete before we get to the final 3 steps, which I'll cover in the second part of this video. So for starters, my first step is to simply identify when you feel guilty. And the best place to start is to get in tune with how often you feel guilty during the course of a day or 2. This is where completing a thought record can help identify which thoughts and situations create feelings of guilt, as well as the frequency and intensity of guilt. For some of us, this can be a very daunting task, as people can be prone to feeling guilty. Yes, guilt proneness is a thing, and not something I just made up. Based on a 2012 study by Dr. Taya Cohen and colleagues, guilt proneness can be defined as a personality trait indicative of a predisposition to experience negative feelings about personal wrongdoing, even when the wrongdoing is private. It's characterized by the anticipation of feeling bad about committing transgressions, rather than by guilty feelings in a particular moment, or generalized guilty feelings that occur without an eliciting event. So once again, let's take a few highlights from a fairly lengthy definition from someone who can clearly write very well. The key takeaways here are that guilt proneness involves a tendency to feel bad, even when it doesn't negatively impact others, feeling bad about thinking about doing something wrong, and generalized guilty feelings without doing anything wrong. If that definition describes you, this step's particularly important, as guilt's likely to become a very common experience. For a second step, you want to ask a better question. And the better question you want to ask when addressing feelings of guilt is, what's fair in this situation? If you could remove yourself from a particular thought or situation, just momentarily, and insert someone else, what would be a fair standard of guilt to hold this person to? For example, let's assume you've had a particularly stressful day and you ask one of your children to unload the dishwasher. And let's assume that your child is a lot like my children and doesn't seem particularly interested in doing it, so they avoid the task. You respond somewhat harshly and say something like, "Why don't you ever listen? Do I have to do everything myself?" Shortly thereafter, you reflect on what just happened and think you're a terrible parent who's likely laying the groundwork for emotionally scarring your child for life. Now let's pretend this scenario happened with someone else. Perhaps a colleague at work you don't even know particularly well. You may feel they responded too harshly and ultimately took the wrong approach, but chances are you don't think this single incident would emotionally scar their child for life. It's also a good chance you don't feel they should lug around long-standing feelings of guilt about being an inadequate parent. Generally speaking, we tend to hold ourselves to a much higher standard and are much more harsh when judging ourselves than we would ever be towards someone else. So I'm going to wrap up today's video here before moving on to the final 3 steps for coping with guilt, which I'll do in part 2 of this video. But to provide a quick recap, based on the 2 most popular theories of guilt, the purpose of guilt is essentially to feel internal pain, which serves as a motivator to undo the damage we've done. But before we can do that, and here's where the homework's going to come into play, it's important to start with the first step in our 5-step plan. And that step is to identify when you feel guilt. So over the course of a day or 2, write down which thoughts and situations create feelings of guilt, as well as the frequency and intensity of these feelings. And second, I want you to review the thoughts and situations that you've listed in your thought record and ask yourself, what would be an appropriate amount of guilt to feel for these thoughts or situations? Or said another way, if someone else had these same thoughts or situations listed, how much guilt do you think they should feel? So I hope you found the research about the purpose of guilt and the initial steps for coping with feelings of guilt to be helpful. If you did, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel by clicking the subscribe button below. And if you ring the bell, you'll be notified the next time we release a video. And of course, feel free to like and share the video, as well as leave a comment. If you're experiencing challenges implementing the steps in this video, please contact us at Sullivan Associates Clinical Psychology. Thank you for watching. Be sure to watch part 2 of my video about how to cope with feelings of guilt, which will be released shortly.